Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific. Of course, you know what is happening out of Moscow.
Well, quite interesting to say.
But not particularly for the African really sports enthusiasts, because so far we don't look good, do we?
We don't. Let's get to that in a minute. A warm welcome to you all, our Facebook followers and Twitter people tweeting us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself and ask us some questions. Today we're going to be talking about a wide range of issues, but maybe we'll start in Moscow. So Shaka, what an exciting time to be in Moscow. The World Cup kicked off last week. There's been a couple games played so far. Bring us up to speed. What's your assessment?
Very interesting, but it seems to be like increasingly becoming the type of competition or a type of World Cup that reminds me, frankly, of something very sad that occurred while the World Cup, was being held in the United States back in 1994. I remember when Colombia was playing against the United States of America, and a man called Escobar, he had very, very romantic and very interesting, really, hair. You know, some kind of afro.
Was he named after Pablo Escobar?
Who knows? They probably could be related. Who knows? But what happened was he committed, at least according to Colombians, frankly, treason in terms of football. He actually scored against his own team, and they couldn't believe someone they call a gringo scoring and beating them in football. And of course, what happens months later or something, you know, something beyond months later, Escobar goes back home, and what happens? He's actually shot and killed because of having committed football treason. And I'm seeing, for example, that lately, really, you have two African teams so far. You have Nigeria. It scored, essentially, own goal. It was defeated. You also have Tunisia. It also did the same thing. And just before we came to the studio, by the way, I saw some consolation. At least a team from Europe, Poland, scoring against Serif and giving an edge to Senegal. So who knows?
Well, it looks like right now Senegal is our only hope because Tunisia didn't do very well. Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria. So it looks like right now if Senegal can score maybe one extra goal, it could be our only hope for this World Cup as Africans.
But hold your champagne, really, because you cannot celebrate until the fat lady sings. You have to wait, frankly, for the final whistle before you begin, you know, being, you know, somewhat enthusiastic and what have you. But who knows? They could actually do it.
But you see, technically speaking, if you have to stay in the competition, you have to win. At least you have to be seen like you want to win. Well, for some of these teams, they just show up, but they haven't actually played to the satisfaction of their fans back home.
Well, even the other teams that have lost so far, they still have a chance because you know, the league type of the first round, you don't have to worry so much because you have to play against 3 different teams. And it is the 2 best that come out of a group that move into the knockout process. Because the next round, you must win. If you lose, you're out.
Shaka, there is an interesting comment coming in from Robert. He's saying, why are African teams losing at the World Cup?
I think they're losing because obviously they're not very well organized, they're not very well trained. They are not really playing in the major leagues, so to speak, even though African individuals are very reasonably well represented in the world football leagues. And you can find a lot of West Africans, North Africans, and what have you, playing in major leagues in Europe and all that kind of stuff. But let's face it, at the end of the day, it's not just a game of individuals. You need a team. Even the great Brazilian teams and what have you, The only time they actually think that they have probably played as a team, in fact, was probably back in 1970 in Mexico City, where they beat Italy 4-1 and clinched the 3rd World Cup trophy. And in fact, they took it home for good. This was a time, my friend, when the last goal was scored by the captain, Carlos Alberto. And the ball was really passed through like 3 different players until they sent it to Pelé, the number 10, who set it up for Carlos Alberto. He just came from nowhere and hit the team, my friend, and you could just see nothing but net. That goal arguably is considered to be one of the best goals that was ever scored in the World Cup.
Wow, interesting. It looks like Senegal just scored a second goal. That's remarkable on their part.
Well, that means that they have a reasonable chance, actually, to move on to the second round. But again, they still have to meet 2 other teams. And these, I think, include Japan and what else? Is it England or something?
Yeah, England played yesterday. So whoever wins now this group, I think this is the end of all the groups. So whoever wins will proceed to the next round. And if they don't perform at the next round, then some of them will start being eliminated one by one.
Well, you see, you have to play 3 teams.
Right.
And out of those 3 teams, you have to get 2 teams which will move to the next round. And so Senegal, for example, still has to play Japan in its group and another team. And so it is after you play the 3 teams, they look at the 3 best in terms of points, and if not, they actually look at the goals that you allowed in or the goals that you scored against and all that kind of stuff, and they get the 2 best to advance to the second round, which is knockout.
Something struck me the other day when I was watching some of the leading teams, for example, Brazil and Germany, the reigning champion. These guys just showed up. They don't seem to be like right there playing the game. They're just playing average like any other mediocre teams that are out there.
But guess what, Paul? Let's face it, whether you are a German soccer player, superstar, megastar, whether you are Brazilian, Argentinian, whether you are Spanish or Portuguese and stuff like that, at the end of the day, you are still a human being. You are a guy with 2 legs. Everybody there has simply 2 legs, 2 hands, 1 heart. So any team can actually do it. It's not just about these traditional historical teams that have won it all. I mean, you're talking about Brazil, of course, perhaps the highest, and then you have Italy, and then you have Germany. These are some of the teams that have won it more than any other teams. But let's face it, I think it is interesting, frankly, that football actually becomes an equal opportunity employer, whereby there are no sacred gods. You know, you don't come to the World Cup knowing who is going to be able to take it all. Anybody can actually do it. And let's face it, yes, you said Germany was beat by Mexico. Mexico probably has never even advanced beyond the quarterfinals, even though it had an opportunity to host the World Cup back in 1970. And you also have Brazil actually drawing with Switzerland, 1-1. But it's still too early.
Shaka, if I was in the betting business, I would bet on maybe one of the underdogs. Can you bet on any of these teams to
be very honest with you, I wouldn't get into that business because, again, it's too early. Ask me, for example, if we reach the semi-finals or even maybe even the quarterfinals, but certainly not in the opening rounds, because anything can happen. You still have some of the best teams sincerely who could still win it. You have Spain, you have Portugal, you have Brazil, you have Germany, and England. Even though England is always talked about, it has only won it once in Wembley. and it was back in 1966. And then France has also only won it once in Paris in 1998. But again, these are good teams. Anything can happen. Argentina has also, is also one of the major leagues. And of course, you have the Uruguays of the world, which won it before many people really knew about what the World Cup was, because the last big deal they did, really, Uruguay beat Brazil in 1950, my friend, in Rio de Janeiro, in the Maracana. The Maracana Stadium happens to be perhaps the largest stadium in the world, at least at that time. It was able to accommodate more than 100,000 spectators. And Uruguay, small Uruguay, beat Brazil. It was like David and Goliath, really, of sorts. And the Brazilians went on to mourn, not only football-wise, but actually in every sense of the word. They actually mourned for the next 20 years, until, not 20 years, because it was actually, they lost in 1950 in the final, and they got it in 1958 for the first time in Sweden. That's when young Pele at 17 actually scored in that goal.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Shaka, let's maybe talk some politics. Let's start in Kenya. Interesting developments in Kenya. The president has come out publicly to talk about corruption. He's called for audit, lifestyle audits for politicians, public servants. Bring us up to speed. What do you read into Kenya's crisis right now?
I think that the president is on the right track. I think that he has come up with a very, very good message. And I think that he has actually the support of most Kenyans. The only problem is that even though he has actually said that when it comes to a lifestyle audit, it will begin with him, because he is the #1 employer, or the commander-in-chief of employers or employees, that kind of stuff. And of course, from him, it will have to go to his deputy president, William Ruto, and it will have to go to the governors and other public officials. But guess what? There are some supporters, for example, of his deputy president, William Ruto, who feel that this is not really a war against corruption, that this is a sort of political witch hunt of sorts, trying to stop their man to ascend to the presidency. Because if you look at the Kenyan newspapers, you watch Kenyan television stations, you listen to Kenyan radios and what have you, everybody seems to know how much, for example, Deputy President William Ruto has amassed in the last 6 years or so. He has become from a very humble person to one of the richest kids in the Republic. And now people are saying, wait a minute, how can you, yesterday you had nothing, today you have 3 helicopters, you have so many hotels, including 680 Hotel, you have many houses, you have a lot of ranches and shambas and what have you. Where did you get this and how did you get it? Are you really fit to be the next president of the Republic of Kenya? So his supporters are saying it is a good thing that the president is saying and offering to be, in fact, the first person to be audited. But they are even going further. They are saying, why not begin with the founding president, Jomo Kenyatta, who happens to be father to the incumbent president, Uhuru Kenyatta. And when you hear about Jomo Kenyatta, he spent about 9 years in prison. He didn't seem to have much, really, when he was there. But when he came back and became Kenya's first prime minister in 1963, and then later became president, he seemed to have accumulated a lot. He seemed, in fact, to have almost become the indigenous Kenyan Lord Daramea. Daramea was an English settler colonialist who was incredibly rich and what have you, and he had some peers who were also rich. But now we are told that, in fact, Kenya belongs to some very few families. And one of the key families is the Kenyatta family. And so the supporters of Kenyatta are also, shooting back and saying, wait a minute, how can you talk about Jomo Kenyatta? This man is long dead. You should in fact be sympathetic and empathetic and talk about how his soul should rest in eternal peace. What if in fact Kenyatta was corrupt? Then what do you do? They are asking. Do you punish him? He's not there. Of course, someone could say, you obviously make sure that that property belongs to the Kenyan people. And so they're saying, but again, let's face it. Let's think that Kenyatta was also, again, corrupt at that time. Does that give, for example, a William Ruto a right to be corrupt?
Absolutely not.
But then again, this is politics really at its best, because is it in fact a fight against corruption? Or is it in fact a sort of political, witch hunt, as somebody is saying, in which case you're looking at some kind of selective and targeted process? Because even the people who are carrying out investigations, some observers are saying they are not clean either. So how far can they in fact go? So it's quite a very interesting case really to look at.
Yeah, in fact, there is a comment here from Moses in Nairobi. He says that he says that the mere fact that President Uhuru Kenyatta is willing to speak about this publicly, it should not stop there. In fact, he's quoting Kalonzo Musyoka, the former vice president and one of the NASA principals, as saying that the parliament should enact a law that goes beyond what the president is saying, so that these people who are culprits, people who have been found guilty of having engaged maybe in corruption or whatever, should be taken through the court process. How would you respond to that kind of?
That is very interesting, but one thing that you should also be aware of, Paul, is that the people who happen to be in the parliament, in the Senate and what have you, it's quite possible that a great number of them probably didn't quite acquire what they have legally. It's quite possible that they may not be very enthusiastic, frankly, about bringing up that kind of bill and passing it into law, a law that, of course, would be ascended to by the president. It's just like really committing a sort of socio-economic political suicide. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see where actually this ends. If it is very serious, if the people of Kenya are very, very serious, and they seem to be serious to know exactly how their leaders became rich and what have you, we have to wait and see. Because let's face it, there are some people who are even saying that lifestyle audit is not sufficient. That in fact, corruption begins at a time when some of these important players are putting together figures that make up the budget. That corruption, in fact, is sort of inbuilt within the budget. And some of these people, if you actually go and do a sort of, lifestyle audit, you probably would not nail them, because they will actually argue, and probably rightly so, that some of these apartments that I own in London, for example, I bought them about 10, 20 years ago. Some of these bank accounts that I have had them for 10 or 15 years ago. Because, mind you, this audit, at least as far as President Kenyatta is concerned, should begin with his tenure, which is 2013. That's when he first came into power. So it's very, very interesting, but at least there seem to be, if we are not doing something about it, at least it has provoked some kind of debate. And this is good for the country. It's also good for Africa.
Yeah, Shaka, let's move along. A lot of our fans want us to talk about the insecurity in Uganda. We have, of course, the former most powerful person in Uganda, former Inspector General of Police, being arrested. As we speak, he's still in detention. He hasn't appeared in court. 26 other senior army and police officers have been arrested as well. along charges of extortion, kidnappings, all sorts of things. In some cases, espionage. Your reaction?
You see, the problem is that we really don't know much about Kale Kaihura. Why, for example, the state or the military, why they decided to arrest him. They seem to have arrested him. Why do I say they seem to have arrested him? Impeccable sources say that, in fact, this man is living in a place called Makindye. Makindye, there happens to be a military police, but he is not in prison. He actually is living in a comfortable house, which reportedly has very good furniture. He has even unfettered access to DSTV. He can actually watch you. He might, in fact, be watching us.
But that sounds like a discrimination. Other people are locked up and thrown in jails. This guy is being treated like a hero of some sort.
Well, you know, ideally, when you think about the way things should be done, really, if you are a senior military officer, you should actually be treated with respect. Because, mind you, he still remains a suspect. He is not guilty.
But when he was in charge of the police, he didn't treat people as suspects. He treated them as criminals, especially when he was dealing with opposition leaders. The way they would beat up opposition leaders under his leadership, that was criminal. I think this guy deserves to be where he is.
Unfortunately, you're right, but what he was doing was not a good thing. The fact that he was doing bad things does not necessarily give the right to the authorities to treat him in a very bad way. Because let's face it, he happened to be the man, in fact, that even went to Parliament and was in support of an idea that emanated from his boss, the appointing authority, President Yoweri Museveni, who said that courts or police should not, in fact, grant bail or police bond to suspects who may have killed or alleged to have killed others and all that kind of stuff. It would be very, very interesting, frankly, if, for example, that type of medicine was actually administered on Mr. Kale Kaihura. He thought that it was a wastage of time for people who have been suspected of murder or terrorism and what have you, to give them bail or to release them on bond. And here he is in a situation where, obviously, let's face it, he's a human being. He needs those types of things. We have to talk about a situation, frankly, where somebody has to be treated according to the law, no matter whether you are General Kale Kaihura or not, and no matter whether Kale Kaihura did not observe that type of doing business. Because let's face it, Kaihura was an Inspector General of Police. By virtue of that, he was expected to be somebody, frankly, that was impartial. But when you look at the manner in which he operated, there is incontrovertible evidence to probably arrive at the conclusion that he was a partisan type of Inspector General of Police, to the extent that he was doing the bidding for his appointing authority. The appointing authority happens to be Yoweri Museveni, because President Museveni, on several occasions, I remember, he referred to him as a very good NRM cadre.
Now what happened?
Well, obviously there are certain things
it's karma, huh?
Well, it could be karma, but it could also be that he probably went beyond the script, because there are allegations that he happened to be cooperating with officials who come from a third-party country, possibly a neighboring country, and others would translate that to mean Rwanda. And that, in fact, what they were doing was not something, frankly, that was sanctioned by the president. So what we are looking at right now, we may be looking at Kale Kaihura having done some bad things here and there and what have you, but it's not Kaihura who is the problem. Kaihura is probably really a symptom, so to speak. I think the problem here is political. is largely political. And probably I would agree with some people who would say that politically, the ruling national resistance movement at this point in time probably finds itself in what you would say is the moral equivalent of an intensive care unit.
Okay, Shaka, let's get in a few comments. Let's start in Nigeria. Chinyere Zifi. What's the reason that a third-term agenda is popular among African leaders? I know that's probably one of the topics you're talking about tomorrow. Maybe help us understand what's going on.
As a matter of fact, we are going to be talking precisely about that tomorrow because as the brother from Nigeria says, it seems to be a sort of a new phenomenon that is developing on the continent. But for the most part, you will find that some of these people who are looking for third terms, most of them with a few exceptions, are people who shot their way to power with the AK-47. And in the process, these people may have done a lot of things that they really feel uncomfortable about, and therefore they happen to be very insecure, people who suffer from huge political complex, psychological, and what have you, who feel that there is no life really after State House. And therefore, they have to make sure they do everything within their power and without their power, to the extent that they actually transform themselves into a sort of presidential monarch, so that they can actually die in office, and then they can be buried. But then, unfortunately, we have some other examples which you probably would not have thought about a few years ago. We have, for example, in Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara. He has hinted that he actually is going to decide in the next 6 or 7 months whether or not he's actually going to be a candidate for president. Previously, there was a constitution in Ivory Coast that had term limits. He is in the second 5-year term, which would actually come to the end in 2 years' time. But this referendum that was conducted earlier gives him an opportunity, because it provides the constitutional window of an opportunity for him to disregard completely what he served under the previous constitution, so that he can actually begin on new slate. But the good thing is, though, there are also some other players who are even doing very, very well. You look at Macky Sall from Senegal, for example. He has actually reduced the presidency from 7 to 5. And the guy in Benin wants to actually come up with a constitutional amendment that would require a president to serve only 1 term, just like Mexico.
Well, Shaka, very briefly, do you think social media can play a role in stopping these guys from advancing their agendas?
Of course, social media can, but social media is operated by human beings. So it's the human beings with the social media that can actually bring about a huge difference. And I think the future really for Africa, and for the world for that matter, lies in the changing demographics. The young people are becoming the majority. They are not invested in the status quo. So when you talk about change, it is the only constant as far as they're concerned. So you need the changing demographics to work together with, in tandem with, social media.
Shaka, unfortunately, I have to cut you off. That's it for our show today. Thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.